Julian and his mother had arrived at the airport on time. As the flight's departure time approached, they took their seats. Julian settled into his window seat, 19F, in the second-to-last row, with his mother right beside him. Christmas was only a day away, and everyone on board was buzzing with excitement to get home. Yet, out of the 92 people on the plane, only one would succeed in making it there. Julian was born on October the 10th, 1954, in Lima, the capital of Peru, as the first and only child of German ornithologist Maria Koepcke and zoologist Hans Wilhelm Koepcke. When he was born, both his mum and dad were working at the Lima Museum of Natural History. He had a normal birth, a regular childhood, and with the guidance of his thoughtful parents, he received a good education. As the years passed and their daughter grew up, when Julian was about 13 or 14, her family decided to leave the capital. They moved deep into the Amazon rainforest in Peru to establish a research station called Panguana, where they could conduct scientific studies. With that, they built the station I mentioned, right in the heart of the jungle. Julian, meanwhile, was studying at a German high school in Lima. But now, he would have to go back and forth between his school in the capital and their new home, the Panguana Research Center. Sometimes he made the journey alone, and other times with his mother. During summer vacations and whenever he had free time, he would spend most of it at the research station with his family. With nature-loving parents, he learned all about the Amazon rainforest and its wildlife, receiving a deep education about the region from his family alongside his formal schooling. Years passed, and by 1971, Julian was 17 and ready to graduate from high school. In fact, when they boarded the plane on December 24th, as I mentioned earlier, they were returning home to their research station right after Julian's graduation ceremony. Julian's mother, Maria, had originally wanted to return to Panguana on December 19th, but Julian was determined to attend his graduation dance. Maria agreed to his request, and they stayed in Lima until the dance on December 23rd. On the very next day, December 24th, they booked their tickets and boarded the plane. Every other flight was fully booked except for one, Lancer Flight 508. Being Christmas Eve, all tickets were sold out, and the only seats left were on the aircraft that Julian's father, Hans, had strongly advised them not to take, the Lockheed L-188 Electra. At the time, this plane had a terrible reputation in the aviation industry, and the main reason seats were still available was precisely because of its well-known poor safety record. But, eager to spend Christmas together as a family, Julian and Maria went ahead and bought the tickets, despite Hans's insistence. The atmosphere on board was cheerful, with everyone excited for Christmas. Flight attendants were serving sandwiches, but in stark contrast to this joy, dark clouds gathered in the sky. It would later come to light that the airline had been aware of the unsuitable weather conditions before takeoff. However, because it was so busy and they could sell all their tickets, they chose not to delay the flight, a decision that tragically would soon prove to be a grave mistake. About half an hour into the flight, the plane flew straight into the storm. Turbulence hit with incredible force, and the passengers' panic grew louder, their cries piercing through the cabin. The plane shook violently, lightning flashed outside. Later, Julian would describe this chaotic scene as being caught in the grip of hell. He heard his mother say, "This is the end." It was the last thing he would ever hear from her. Suddenly, everything turned blindingly white. A bolt of lightning had struck the plane. Flames erupted, and the aircraft began to break apart, just like a scene from a movie. The plane shattered, and passengers were thrown through the sky in all directions. Julian's seat broke away from the aircraft, along with the window section beside him, and entered freefall. The drop began from around 3,000 meters. His mother and the other passengers drifted one way, while Julian hurtled in another. He lost consciousness and continued to fall. When he woke up, he saw the jungle approaching rapidly below. The dense canopy reminded him of broccoli, or at least that's how he would later describe it. When she regained consciousness, she found herself lying on the soft forest floor, covered in mud and without her glasses. Her left eye was swollen. She had suffered a concussion. Her collarbone was broken, and her body was covered in cuts and bruises, but she was still alive. Later, she would recall feeling not fear, but an overwhelming sense of abandonment at that moment. "I'll never forget what I saw when I opened my eyes," she wrote about waking up, describing the sight of towering trees and golden light illuminating every shade of green around her. She lay there, curled up in a fetal position, motionless for the rest of the day and into the next morning. Shock alone was overwhelming, and her injuries made it even worse. Without her glasses, which were essential for her vision, everything around her was a blur, but she knew she had to do something. She called out for her mother over and over, but all she could hear were the sounds of the forest animals. She reached out with her hands, feeling around for anything useful, and eventually found a bag of candy, likely someone's Christmas gift. With nothing but a light summer dress, one sandal, the other lost in the crash, and the bag of candy, she started moving. Though unsure of the best direction, she tried to focus on any sound she could follow, knowing that heading the wrong way would lead her deeper into the forest, where she might never be found. Following the sound of running water, she came across some scattered seats from the plain. One seat had a woman dressed in a skirt, partially buried in the mud from the force of the crash. As she got closer, she saw that the woman's toenails were painted. Her mother never wore nail polish. Relieved, she understood the lifeless body wasn't her mother's and continued on her way. Though she occasionally heard what she thought were the sounds of search planes flying overhead, there was no way she could signal to them through the dense jungle canopy. Her only chance was to find someone or be found. For 3 or 4 days, still in shock, she stumbled on, pushing herself forward in dreadful conditions. She had no lighter or knife, surviving only on the small bag of candy and drinking water when she could find it. But the wounds on her body began to fill with maggots. She was in pain, cold, and unable to sleep properly as the endless rain soaked her through. Each day she followed the flowing water, and when night fell, she searched for a sheltered spot by the riverbank. She tried to guess the time based on the intensity of the daylight, and could only manage to sleep in short, uncomfortable stretches, the cold keeping her from drifting off completely. When it wasn't raining, mosquitoes and insects tormented her relentlessly. Most importantly, she kept thinking about her mother, holding on to the hope that perhaps she had already been rescued. On the 6th day, as she followed the river, Juliane noticed that it had widened. To avoid stepping on poisonous snakes or spiders, she decided to walk in the water. Eventually, exhausted and weak, she let the current carry her down the middle of the river. She was aware of the threats she faced, both in the water and on land, but by now she had no strength left to keep moving on her own. Using the survival skills her parents had taught her, Juliane struggled to stay alive. But, as I mentioned, her strength was nearly gone, and mentally she was on the verge of collapse. And who could blame her? A 17-year-old girl with broken bones, wounds infested with maggots, wearing only a thin dress and a single sandal, trying to survive for days in the Amazon rainforest. It was an ordeal few could endure without losing their sanity. The days blurred together, and by now 9 days had passed. Juliane had been fighting to survive alone for 9 days, until finally she spotted a small hut with a roof made of palm leaves by the riverbank. With her last bit of energy, Juliane entered the hut, hoping to find something to eat, but found nothing. The only item inside was a container of gasoline. She lay down, her body covered in cuts that had worsened over the days. The wound on her shoulder, in particular, was infested with maggots. At that moment, she remembered a technique her father had used on an injured dog at their research station. Following his example, she took the gasoline container and poured it over her wound, attempting to flush out the approximately 30 maggots burrowed in her skin. Exhausted beyond measure, she finally drifted off to sleep in the hut, the only dry place she had found in 9 days. On the 10th day of her ordeal, Juliane awoke at dawn to the sound of men's voices. As soon as she heard them, she burst out of the hut and ran outside. There, she came face to face with Peruvian fishermen, who were shocked to see a thin, dirt-covered and wounded girl. She managed to say, "I'm Juliane. I survived a plane crash. Please help me," before collapsing into their arms. The fishermen provided her with basic first aid on the spot, and then took her to their village by canoe. From there, they notified authorities, and Juliane was soon transported by plane to a hospital where her treatment began. Against all odds, Juliane Koepcke had survived 10 days in the jungle, emerging alive from the nightmare she had endured. When the plane took off from Lima, it carried 86 passengers and 6 crew members, totaling 92 people. In the crash, 91 people, including Juliane's mother, Maria Koepcke, lost their lives. Reports indicated that, while 14 people initially survived the plane's disintegration and fall, none were as fortunate as Juliane. Those survivors ultimately perished while waiting to be rescued. Official records listed 17-year-old Juliane as the sole survivor. After quickly receiving treatment at the hospital, Juliane was taken back to the crash site by authorities to help rescue teams search for any other potential survivors. Still in shock, she returned to the very place that had transformed her life forever. Later, she returned to her homeland, Germany, with her father. As the years passed, she followed in her parents' footsteps, studying biology at Kiel University, from which she graduated in 1980. She went on to earn a doctorate and eventually returned to Peru, where she continued her research alongside her father until his death in 2000. At that point, she took over as director of the Panguana Research Center, founded by her parents, and has continued to run it in their memory to this day. Books have been written about Juliane by herself and other authors, and films and documentaries have been made about her story. Yet, the question that still lingers in her mind is why she alone survived that tragic crash. And that, in essence, is the story of Juliane's incredible survival. Although I could tell it in mere minutes, it remains an almost unbelievable escape. While many answers could be proposed as to why only she survived, the most important thing is that she did.